We will start off with a presentation from Crystal, and then we will have a presentation from the proponent team, which includes, I see Erica here, and perhaps Erica, when you get the moment on the spotlight, you can introduce your other team members. And then we will go into questions and then eventually a discussion and a motion. So Crystal, please carry on.
Great, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? And you can see the screen, I'm assuming?
Looks good.
Great, awesome. Okay, so as Jim said, this is application for an OCP amendment, a rezoning and a development permit with variance. The site's located in the heart of Old Town, which is a heritage conservation area. The site is located at 603 Pandora and is adjacent to Centennial Square. If you could just, people could mute their microphones, that would be helpful. Thank you. It's situated along the east-west main artery of Pandora and along the north-south artery of Government Street, and the site's surrounded by heritage registered and heritage designated buildings. This property was the location of the Plaza Hotel, and prior to that was known as the West Home, or the Hotel West Home. It was heritage designated in 2013, and on May 6, 2019, the building was destroyed by fire with only a few elements remaining. Due to the location, we apply the Old Town design guidelines to the site as it's an infill building within a heritage conservation area. The objectives of the guidelines are to foster new building designs that respect, complement, and contribute positively to the historic context of Old Town. The guidelines are meant to reinforce existing character of the Old Town and to ensure that new buildings do not detract from the established character of this area. Sorry, I just got distracted there. The guidelines speak to human scale, appropriately scaled building mass, articulation, and detailing of facades. The guidelines speak to cohesiveness of the character of Old Town, as well as authenticity, to ensure new buildings are both distinguishable from the historic buildings while being sympathetic and subordinate to and compatible in their proportions, mass, scale, and rhythm. In the following slides, I will present images showing the context of Old Town, and you will note the following selected character-defining elements of this heritage conservation area. The classically inspired three-part building facades with clearly defined base, middle, and top. Vertical facades expressed by use of structural bays, vertical elements, and proportions, punched windows, including double-hung windows at the upper stories. The use of high-quality materials such as wood, metal, brick, natural stone, and glass. They use well-crafted facade ornamentation and detailing. There's a continuous street wall with chamfered building corners at street intersections. A variety range of low to mid-scale building heights ranging from 2 to 5 stories. Varied and attractive roof lines accented by parapets and cornices, and architecturally distinctive buildings at street heads. These are context photos showing the character of the buildings, which are adjacent to the proposed along Government Street. You can see that they range from 2 to 3 stories maximum. They are varied and each distinctive, but they share similar qualities such as proportion and verticality, and two buildings use the chamfered edge at the corner. They have a clear base, middle, and top, and use ornamentation as well as parapets and cornice lines. The materials are durable and high quality, and they use vertically proportioned double-hung windows. They are also all of a similar scale that favors the pedestrian experience. And these are the adjacent buildings along Pandora Avenue near the proposed site. Again, they are 2 to 3 stories. This slide shows the context and character of Old Town, but focusing on the hotels in this area. Note that this is a mix of historic and contemporary buildings, and that some of these buildings are slightly higher than context. However, the buildings that are contemporary meet many of the Old Town design guidelines, such as stepping back at upper stories, chamfering the corner edge, clearly defining the base, middle, and top. They emphasize the vertical and complement the context and contribute to the overall cohesiveness and character of Old Town. This slide shows some of the larger scaled historic buildings in Old Town. Although they are larger buildings, the ground level retains the human scale and proportions of other surrounding buildings. They have clearly defined base, middle, and top. They use high quality materials that are natural and ornamentation and detailing. Where they are on a corner and at intersections, the architecture expresses this. There are a variety of ways that each building breaks up the facade, whether it is a change of material, the use of strong cornice lines, change of window size and shape, and all of these attributes which are character defining elements add to the cohesiveness, again, of the character of Old Town. The application before us is for a 12-story hotel which accommodates approximately 200 rooms, and the design utilizes a prefabricated modular construction approach. This view along Pandora is the elevation which includes the parking garage door and the entrance to the hotel at the ground level. This elevation faces the McPherson Theater and Centennial Square. Sorry, one second. This elevation is along Government Street with commercial units at the ground level. The building design utilizes cementitious boards in both plank and panel formats, all one color except for the accent color shown in the elevation. Take note of the perceived height of the ground level, as it's almost double the height of the ground level of adjacent buildings. Before the Plaza Hotel burned down in the fire, the property had gone through a rezoning, and so the new zoning allows for 23.1 meters in height, which is approximately 7 stories. As noted in the report, the OCP and related policies see a maximum of 15 meters or 5 stories for Old Town. Again, the majority of the buildings adjacent to this property are 2 to 3 stories. Using the slide, I also want to speak to the windows, and the majority of the windows are square in orientation and not vertical, as per the guidelines, and the degree of repetition reinforces the scale and massing, which overwhelms the existing context. Also noting that the base is defined, which is good, but again, over in height to what would be typical, so it can change the pedestrian experience when walking along Government. Also, the building above the base does not have a clearly defined middle and top and doesn't utilize architectural articulation, such as breaks in facade or change in material to aid in breaking up the mass. At the Pandora Street elevation, the entrance to the building is not emphasized and the corner condition is underutilized, not reflecting the character of other buildings in Old Town. The blank facade at this location along Pandora is not appropriate and underscores the bulk, emphasizing the mass and the height. Staff would recommend opportunities to reduce the blank facade, such as articulating with added fenestration, detailing, change of materials, added color, change of proportions, and rhythm, or reducing highly textured finishes or even artwork. And here we have the side elevation or back elevation and a section through the parking garage. Here's a section through the block at the side elevation, looking north on Government. Note that most of the elevations do not step back upper stories, and the application also asks for variances on the overall building setbacks. Due to the height being over 38 meters, this building is considered a tall commercial building and therefore requires a 6-meter side and rear yard setback for portions of the building over 23 meters in height. The proposal has a 1.25 setback at the east property line and a 4-meter setback to its south. The Old Town Design Guidelines state that new buildings should incorporate high-quality durable materials into facades and that the colors and textures should complement those found in Old Town. Materials selected should be visually interesting with textures and patterns, and that the exterior materials and colors should reflect local heritage palettes. The materials proposed for 603 Pandora are cementitious panels in plank format and large format. The legend on the elevations also indicates the use of metal around the windows and for the accent color. Staff have concerns with the overuse of this material, especially on a building of this scale. Staff would prefer to see a high-quality natural material used, especially at the street-facing facades and at the ground levels. More variety of materials that reflect the character of the area would be recommended. I will note that cementitious panels, especially the size and shape shown in the elevations, doesn't meet the guidelines, is not considered a high-quality natural material, and also not considered masonry. Therefore, it doesn't fit in the context of Old Town. I've walked around the city to capture the views used in the renderings, and on the following 4 slides, I've shown what is the existing context on the left and the proposed rendering on the right. The first view is looking south along Government. You can see the McPherson Playhouse to the east and Chinatown to the west. And here you can see the massive scale of this building and how it overwhelms the heritage conservation area. In addition to being out of scale and over in height, which is in opposition to policy and the guidelines, the proposal has not implemented ways to reduce the perception of its mass and scale. They could have stepped back upper stories or articulated the facade to celebrate the corner condition and could have created breaks in the length to emphasize its verticality. Here we are looking north along Government, and you can see the scale of the buildings directly adjacent to the proposed on the same block. As you can see, the proposed is out of scale to the rest of the block, and the tall blank facades do little to reduce the perceived scale. Here's the perspective from Centennial Square, and you can see the scale of the proposed is not sensitively integrated into this important intersection at Pandora and Government. Lastly, the view looking west along Pandora from City Hall. The massing from all angles is bulky. And again, in addition to being too tall for this area, there has been no design solutions utilized that might minimize the scale and massing. Staff requests that the panel review this proposal against all relevant policy, including the Old Town Design Guidelines. And I will finish here and I'll turn it over to the applicant team to give their presentation. Thank you.
Are you able to see that now?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for taking your time today, and thanks to Crystal for a very comprehensive presentation. We'll be focusing on the heritage aspects of the project rather than going through a full walk through the architectural proposal, but we do, of course, have the full set of application drawings handy for reference at the end for questions and discussion. My name's Erica Sangster. I'm a principal architect at DAU Studio. I'll be presenting today with heritage consultant Donald Luxton, and we're also joined by my colleague Frank D'Ambrosio, co-principal at DAU, and from the owners group, Nick Askew from Ocean Gate Developments. Crystal has outlined the location in the city, so I won't dwell on this. It's a very prominent corner of Government and Pandora, very important to the city. The building was unfortunately destroyed by fire in 2019, and at that time, materials from the structure were identified for salvage. These were the materials that were able to be saved, including structural timbers, glazed bricks, 2 stone columns, and some panels of sidewalk prisms. I know this isn't our focus today, but just to give you some context, the sidewalk panels we expect will be added to the city inventory, and the other materials will be integrated into a commemorative display in the interior of the project, and we'll be handling that during the detailed design stage. In late 2019, our team was engaged by the client to design a new hotel for this site. And the challenge, which I think is evident to us all, has been to develop a concept that is both responsive to this unique location in the city and at the same time meets the functional and economic criteria for a viable hotel program. We've done our best here to propose a project that balances city priorities by carefully integrating the contemporary program into the heritage context. And excuse me, I'll drink some water. But to start, I'll pass this over to Don Luxton, who will walk us through the heritage rationale that was really a fundamental underpinning of the concept.
Great, thank you, Erica. Everybody can hear me, I assume. Of course, within this context and the guidelines that we were reviewing, we include the standards and guidelines, and the staff has identified, of course, the standards themselves, especially Standard 11 and the cultural landscape design guidelines, part of the cultural landscape section of the standards and guidelines. Next slide, please. So this is really interesting site within Old Town, and it was a real challenge to try and tackle many different aspects of the urban form. We'll talk about the urban form first, and then the architectural response second. The urban form is actually quite unique at this point, and it results from the original subdivision. You can see that in the 1861 map. You can see the fort there, the south part of the image, and this is the hinge point where the street grid shifted, and it shifts kind of right at this intersection. Government Street bends a little bit to the west, and because of the street grid divergence, it creates two wedge-shaped blocks between Cormorant, which runs straight through for 3 blocks, and Pandora, which then enters Government at what was actually a very awkward angle. But this was kind of the basis of the subsequent buildings that ended up on this site. Next slide, please. These two wedge-shaped blocks that are sitting here, ultimately, as they were built out, this is the 1913 revision of the fire insurance map. You'll see how Cormorant Street goes straight through, Pandora Avenue comes into Government Street, and there's kind of a funneling of views at this particular point. Next slide, please. And we can see in this 1947 the sort of built-out form of Old Town, and what was beginning to happen in Old Town during the Great Edwardian Boom, which resulted in quite a number of larger buildings, some of which you can see in this photograph. And there was a tendency within the architecture of Old Town to shift from Victorian era to Edwardian era. The larger buildings are Edwardian, and you can see that ultimately that was the inspiration for this building, not to try and mimic something that was Victorian in nature, and I'll explain that more under the architectural response. And you can see here, this was the form that was inherited at the into the post-war era, Cormorant Street running straight through. Now, there were a number of changes to the street grid that happened to the west of here because of the Johnson Street Bridge, but the biggest change, of course, was, next slide, please, the construction of Centennial Square in the 1960s, when Cormorant Street was basically closed off through the Centennial Square area. Pandora Street bent to enter into what became what was previously Cormorant Street, and there were closure of streets, redirection, and then buildings removed. And this all created a pool of open space that was part of the overall strategy for the revitalization of downtown at the time, which included, of course, Bastion Square, the construction of parkades, and Centennial Square and the McPherson, all at the same time. Next slide, please. So in response to this, there is a very unique urban form at this spot, and that will be described, the massing response will be described by Erica in the next part of the presentation. But it's really important to understand the funneling of views both from the south and the north and around this corner, which uniquely has open space at 3 corners of the intersection. So it really does form, in essence, a gateway condition. It's a hinge point between the Old Town Commercial District and Chinatown. It is the marker of the edge of these two areas, and it does begin to heal the street wall that is now missing. Next slide, please. It also recognizes that at the edge and around and at the south end of Old Town is where the larger buildings were occurring during the Edwardian era, during the boom time, that was changing some of the character of Old Town. Next slide, please. So in addition to those comments, there's a finer grained response to the architecture of Old Town. And to explain the thinking behind that was driving this, our discussions trying to resolve some of these issues, first of all, we are not trying to mimic Victorian era architecture. So we are not looking to a smaller scale, more fine-grained kind of approach to articulating the building. We are looking at essentially Edwardian era neoclassicism and the larger buildings, the skyscrapers that got built during the Edwardian era. This one was demolished in the 60s, the BC Permanent Building, but I think it illustrates, first of all, the subtle distinction of the tripartite articulation. It doesn't have the huge overhanging cornice. It has more simple banding, more simple articulation. But particularly, I would note the window openings. They are not the same as the sort of punch vertical windows that we tend to see in Victorian buildings. We're looking at banks of windows, more square or rectangular with individual muntins in that larger opening that express the cage and the structure of the building. And I will note that there are a number of examples in Old Town that are very much like this. Belmont Building, Union Bank, Central Building, Carlton Plaza's an example. Sayward Building, Pemberton, big cubic structures that express the new technology of that new century. The surface articulation is meant to reflect this Edwardian era sensibility, and there is a consistent vertical and horizontal weave that animates the building as articulated. Next slide, please. And notably, these buildings are the inspiration through this Edwardian neoclassicism is indeed different. There's a variety of styles, buildings, articulation in Old Town. It's not as uniform, I think, as we might think it is. I guess I'm a little surprised to think that this masonry product is not masonry. It's intended to be masonry expression. And we worked long and hard on the storefronts to get them to reflect this kind of over height that we see in many of the Victorian and Edwardian buildings, and bring some detailing and articulation through the use of metal elements, solid metal like C-channels, steel, to the ground floor to give it some real weight and heft. I'll turn it back to Erica now. Thank you. Oh, one more. I
was going to say, Don, this is your slide, not mine.
Standard 11. So we worked through these are really tough issues to resolve, as you can imagine, and so we did work through Standard 11 to try and understand physical and visual compatibility, subordination, distinguishability. Distinguishability is pretty easy, as you can see, but Standard 4, we do not mimic historic architecture, and we're trying really hard to be inspired, not mimic. Subordination, we know does not mean smaller, but we're trying not to compete for attention. The one issue that is really clear is that the building needs to be quieter and a more background building than have a lot of stuff on it to draw attention to itself. So the palette of materials remains generally very muted. And physical and visual compatibility, first of all, critically, and Erica will mention the street walls, the Edwardian era vernacular, and materials and proportions that we're trying to not calibrate to the earlier buildings in the area, but the century-old buildings in the area. And I'll turn it over to Erica at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Just looking at the site in context, the Pandora frontage has for many years now been dominated by the vehicle lanes that provided access to the older Plaza Hotel off both Government Street and Pandora. Older drawings of this space and the paving that still exists indicate that this was considered an extension of Centennial Square, but for some time it hasn't been a successful pedestrian space. So one of our starting points was to look at how to create a more vibrant and meaningful public plaza, how to repair this gap in the city fabric in such a way that fully responds to this as a unique urban juncture in the city. Because the plaza is north of the site, even just a 3-story building within the property boundaries would really shade much of that new public space through the early mid-afternoon. So to improve sun exposure to the plaza, we looked at setting the building mass at an angle, pivoting it to align with that bend in Pandora Avenue and bring early afternoon sun past the building into the public space. This angled massing also widens the Government Street sidewalk in a sort of funneling way, like Don was describing, and creates a directional view to the McPherson Playhouse entrance and Centennial Square. To accomplish this positive urban gesture, we've proposed a reciprocal easement that trades a modest projection of the building over the north property line, it's cantilevered, with an expansion of public space along Government Street. The 200-room hotel has been shaped as a 12-story fabric building, as Don alluded to. And in terms of expression, it takes cues from those taller Edwardian-era buildings. The massing completes the street wall on Government Street, then pivots to respond to that 1960s Centennial Square plan. Where the building abuts neighboring buildings, the massing steps back to provide a height transition and to allow for articulation and glazing on what would more traditionally have been blank party walls. We've attempted to create a really distinct base, middle, and top to the building. In this view, you can see how the top 3 stories are visually grouped together by those copper-colored panels that are between the windows vertically, and a change in cladding from the more textured, smaller format material to larger format, smoother panels. The bend in that main facade that you can see in this view divides that longer facade in length and brings all facades very close to or under that 30-meter maximum that was mentioned in the report. We developed this gridded facade expression as a weave of vertical and horizontal elements with windows that are deeply recessed into the facade. There are metal liners that slope both at one of the jambs and at the sill that help to de-emphasize the horizontal banding and strengthen the vertical relationship between the windows. The materials palette, which is shown on the left of this slide, we've selected carefully to be, we thought, appropriate to the old town in finish, scale, and quality. The main cladding is a durable, high-quality material with a matte finish and a range of textures, not deployed in some of those examples that were shown previously where it's all a smooth finish. We're looking at the range of there's a sort of sandblasting treatment where you get a range of finishes to the product. And we've selected the color of that material to have more of a limestone tone, which we think is appropriate to Victoria. So it's a lighter tone, but it's certainly not a white building. In addition to this, metal in a combination of warm copper and pewter finishes brings contrast to the facades and brings more warmth to the building. At the street level, we've done some work on the project to extend the pilasters from above down to the ground so that the structure of the building is visually expressed as it lands on the base through the base of the building, and at the ground floor it frames bays of storefront glazing. We've added cast steel elements that would subdivide the bays into smaller scaled windows. The majority of the Government Street frontage is active commercial use with a recessed entry close to the corner and spill-out patio space to activate the widened sidewalk. The hotel entrance and lobby are located on the Pandora frontage to the eastern edge of the public plaza. Looking a bit closer at the ground floor facade, the steel dividers between the windows are a bit of an homage to the cast iron facade elements of older buildings. The pilasters step in plan to provide some visual interest and scale and to emphasize their verticality. These glazing bays, when you look at the glazing, are 6 meters tall, so there is a modest increase from the guideline minimum. And this allows for hotel service functions to be located above the ground floor on a second level that's internal to the building. And this helps preserve frontage for uses that will activate the public interface and have a few of those hotel functions actually taking up prominent facade space. I think we're over time. Unfortunately, it's been a really quick tour through the building architecture. But like I mentioned earlier, we have the full application handy for reference during discussion, and we look forward to hearing your questions.